Good evening. Today we'll try to cover up the fourth mm, unit of this block, and that is exclusively about the Australian novel, modern novel, and Australian fiction, which is divided into three phases. One of 19th century and one of the second phase is early 20th century and the third phase is later 20th century. So we will begin with the modern Australian novel, the gradual growth of self-identity, how they wanted to represent the their own tradition and culture, and how various development phases and major issues and concerns of Australian writers. And before we begin, let us briefly touch on the social and cultural context which we have already done in our past class. So, Australia, as we all know, was discovered by Captain James Cook in 1770 and colonized by the British 80 years later when the first fleet landed at Botany Bay in 1788 under the commandership of Captain Arthur Phillip. The historic landing occurred on 18th January 1788, but Captain Phillip and his crew did not settle there. The fleet sailed further north and landed eventually at Port Jackson, Sydney, 8 days later to commemorate the landing of the first fleet. January 26th is celebrated annually as the Australian Day. Uh, then all these things are known to us just a kind of refreshment of our knowledge of Australian settlement. When we begin with the 20th century, Australia was largely a white Anglo-Saxon settlement, most settlers being of English or Irish origin. It was only in the later half of the 20th century, after World War II, that several nationalities migrated to Australia and the island continent is now home to about 19 million people, with nearly 30% belonging to non-British stock. The new settlers in Australia were faced with several problems, like a strange new environment, hostile physical conditions that necessitated adaptability, whereby survival depended on innovativeness and adaptability. The original inhabitants of Australia, the Aborigines, lived with the land, whereas the whites lived from the land and thus encountered many difficulties. This vital issue of survival in the new colony forms the theme of much of the early fiction of Australia, where there are several recurring images of early settlers taming the land, of harsh and hostile crop, of lonely outbacks. But all this changed when gold was discovered in Australia in 1851. Edward Hargreave, a gold digger from California, discovered gold in New South Wales. Gold miners from Europe, America, China, the British Isles arrived in New South Wales The golden era had dawned in the 1850s. Hitherto, the image of life in Australia was hard and difficult. With the gold rush, the image changed overnight to that of excitement, prosperity, and adventure. Freed settlers came to Australia as a result of the gold rush, and between 1852 and 1861, more than 1 million people had migrated to the land of opportunity, that is Australia. It is believed that the gold rush more or less marked the end of the pioneering phase of Australian society. By the mid 1860s, the European disturbance is there. Please check it. It is believed that the gold rush more or less marked the end of the pioneering phase of Australian society. By the end, by the mid 1860s, the European population of Australia itself was about 150,000. The 1891 census depicts two-thirds of the population as Australian born, of which 20% were of Irish descent. With the growth of the sugar industry, as many as 62,000 Pacific Islanders were encouraged to migrate to Queensland. By 1991, the Australian population stood at 5 million. The Aborigines were granted citizenship rights only in 1957, and Australia began following a multicultural policy as opposed to the hitherto white-only policy in 1973. These things help us to control and understand the Australian model uh, in a nutshell. Then the first phase of which began in early 19th centuries. We'll discuss briefly about that. In the beginning, fictionalized accounts of colonial life, mainly for the use of future migrants, were produced. These early sightings, mainly memoirs, annals, diaries, etc., were factual accounts of colonial life. However, the memoirs of James Harley Fox, 1890, marks the initial transition from factual accounts to fiction. Fox memoirs is in the tradition of the English picaresque novel of the 18th century. Fox was one of the first to take the trouble of creating a vocabulary of the class language, a dictionary for translating the idiom of the felons, convicts, to plain English. Avery, Crowcroft, and Harris all began writing in the fictional mood. Henry Sorbe's Quintus Servinton, the first novel to be published in Australia. You have to remember this name, Henry Savery, and the novel's name is Quintus Servinton. The first novel to be published in Australia is largely derived from English fiction. He wrote
Happy
with
birthday.
a targeted readership, namely largely derived
Good
from
morning,
English fiction,
Junaid.
the lower class of migrants. He has given us the first romantically drawn convict character, Ralph Russell, 1844-45, by John Tucker, sheds light on convict life. It deals with horror, brutality, and even the picarous experience of Ralph. The novel's chief charm lies in its historical interest and a growing taste for the romance of adventure. From 1850s onwards, such documentarized writing took shape of novels and short stories. Kingsley's
Light
The
का लोग
Recollection of
Junaid.
Jeffrey Hamlin, 1859, Please mute your mic, is the story of a migrant pastoralist family who, having made a fortune in Australia, wish to return home in order to enjoy the fruits of the labor in a civilized country. It is important because Kingsley began a new tradition whereby he appropriated the memoir style and adapted it to romance so well that henceforth the romance became the dominant form in Australian fiction. In the later novels, the Villiers and the Backrooms present a contradicting picture of colonial life. A family of blacksmiths from England who, being low on the social ladder, have come to Australia, the land of equality and opportunity. They desire ever to return to class-bound and hierarchy-conscious settlement, class-conscious England. Within a short time, we see the evolution of Australia from a penal settlement to the land of opportunity, where one can make a fortune, and the land of equals, where rigid social conventions have ceased to exist. Mention must also be made of the women nobles of this period in the convict tradition, like Caroline Licky's The Broad Arrow, 1859. Aisha, Aji, please mute your mic.
ये जी दूध दूध चाय कहते भी कहते ना मैं तो भी तो दे सकता था
Aisha, Aji, please mute your mic. Okay, thank you. The novel is set in Adel- Adelaide. It deals largely with the conventions of colonial life, but spans may have been trying to do was emphasize the fact that the life of the community actually goes on inside the people's homes and not in the great outdoor, the bush. She maps out the character of Adelaide life in the period of the Gold Rush, 1951-52. Her novel is important for two reasons. One, it accords more importance to opinions while treating plot and character as subordinates. And two, the setting, which was normally a mere backdrop in the earlier writings, emerges as a foreground in the novel. The setting, again, is not a physical description of Adelaide, but the cultural context and the very essence of the community. Mrs. Campbell's praise Mrs. Campbell Pratt's best work is Policy and Passion, a novel of Australian life, 1881. She concentrates chiefly on the quote-unquote inner workings, the social interests of Australian life, and uses the conventional romance mode to achieve this end. Ada Cambridge and Thomas Thasma Jesse Cobrier were some of the early women writers of the period. Tasma's best novel is Uncle Piper of Piper Hill, an Australian novel 1889, in which she analyzes the cultural pretensions of the age. The second page consists of writers like um, Henry Lawson and the poems of Christopher Brennan, where Australia was a conglomeration of several independent penal colonies. What the Australians now wanted was a federation. The political move towards demanding and creating a federation necessitated the emergence of an Australian consciousness and an authentic Australian literature that did not recognize English conventions, manners, social behavior, or literary achievement. What they needed was a body of literature that moved away from English and the Anglo-Australian literary tradition. What emerged, therefore, was a set of conventions glorifying the great outdoor, the romance of the bush. It is generally believed that the Sydney Bulletin, hereafter referred to as the Bulletin, published in 1880, was responsible for the promotion of the great Australian outdoor but local colour. The currency, lead, and bush ethics had already made an appearance in the writings of people like Kingsley and Boulder, Boulder, while Thorpe, Max Franklin, Catherine Susan uh, Pritchard, and Frank Dalby dealt with bush ethics in a romantic, sentimental manner. What the bulletin did, however, was bring about narrative changes, and what now emerged was a dry, laconic style and an Australian voice, particularly in the bush ballads and the short stories. It was during this era that the bush became truly Australian and indicative of the Australian nation. The literature of this period reflects the values of rural life and small communities, while promoting independence and the right to equality. At around the same time, towards the last decades of the 19th century, political momentum garnered support and ultimately culminated in the formation of the Federation in 1901 and is reflected by works like Joseph Purphy's Such is Life. So, then we come to William Goyes Hay. William Gossi Hayes, The Escape of the Notorious Sir William Hines, and The Mystery of Mr. Daint, A Romance of Tasmania, 1919, Captain Quadring, 1912, The Mystery of Alfred Doubt, 1937, was one of the minor writers of the same period. Around about the same time, a literature of the city experience too began to emerge, in which the bush was exchanged for the push. Louis Stone's Jonan, 1911, is a mixed study of street life in the inner suburbs of Sydney, in which Stone manages to catch the idiom of the area, the manners and values of the people. Miles Franklin, uh, My Brilliant Career, 1901, was fiercely loyal and totally committed to the distinctively Australian. Like, her narratives are heavily romantic, both in theme and treatment. Her other works include My Career Goes Big, Bong, purporting to be the autobiography of Sibylla Penelope Melvin, 1946, and All That Was, 1936. Norman Lindsay, about whom we discussed yesterday, though a short story writer, is largely remembered for his encouragement of and influence on many of the budding writers of the earlier part of the 20th century. His novels took great pleasure in scandalizing middle class morality, and its characters are largely cartoon figures known for their eccentricities and idiosyncrasies. His writings were, however, free of the obsession with landscape, realism, and its preoccupation with the bush life. His other works include The Magic Pudding, 1918, and Red Heap, 1930, and um, Salurdi, 1934. This traditional notion of Australia may be noticed in Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Honest, 1895. Here is a bit of conversation between Sicily and Algernon. Sicily says, I don't think you will require neckties. Uncle Jack is sending you to Australia. Algernon, Australia, I would sooner die. So this is the description of Australia that we find in Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Honest, where we see um, we get a glimpse of the continent, and highly hostile and um, unhospitable country, and slowly these things are depicted in modern Australian novels, and the important aspects of the rise and development of modern Australian novel also includes the life of the Aborigines, their struggle and the white settlement, their alignedness, all the things are depicted in the modern Australian novel. And uh, when you see the development of the novel page wise, we have uh, some categories like romance fiction, melodramatic fiction, like this, and we will have some brief discussion about these phases, and then we'll go to our main focus today, Patrick White's novel Pause, which has won him the Nobel Prize. Mm, romance fiction, the coming race in Australia is the major theme of the early novels, as evident in Joseph Purvis' Such is Life, 1903. The romance mode in which novels contextualizes the theme of settlement and is often centered around an exotic and imaginary land. This is particularly noticeable in H. Rider Haggard's Fugitive Annie, published in 1902. Then we'll come to this second type, that is the melodramatic fiction. The melodramatic mood is largely projected in novels dealing with the contrast between the settlers and the aborigines, the gaolers and the convicts, the landed and the lawless, and so on. Xavier Abbott's Capricornia, 1938, and Christina State's The Man Who Loved Children, 1940, are pertinent examples. The melodramatic mood once again renews itself in the recent fiction of Thomas Kennelly and Kate Greenville. But this new melodramatic mood is largely prompted by a sense of loss of identity by the hegemony of the European powers in present times. Then we come to the third important phase, that is the historical fiction. The fiction belonging to this category historicizes the theme of settlement and exploration. Thus, Martina Boyd in the Cardboard Crown 1952, shows the decline of Olympian bourgeoisie. Robert Davis in the Savage Cows 1976 shows the gradual extinction of the aborigines of of Tasmania. Patrick White's Voice, which we will deal with, in detail um, in the next units, is very important. Was published in 1957, and A Fringe of Leaves 1976 deal with the complex themes of exploration and relationship. Again, Monroe, uh, Narodin, Colin Johnson in his Long Live Sandwara 1979 concentrates on the oppression of the Aborigines. In recent times, Peter Carey presents a comic conspectus of the Australian colonial history in his Oscar and Lucinda 1988. These historical novels may be regarded as an attempt to rewrite Australian national history. In other words, these are fictional authentication of colonial memory. Then comes the realistic fiction. The growing sense of realism in terms of sordid, down to earth life also comes to be the subject of many Australian novels. Thus, Louis Stone's and Jonah or Kenneth McNeese, The Refugee, presents a moving picture of the urban life of Sydney as also its working class life. There are even traces of creating certain forms of psychological realism. Elizabeth Jolie, for instance, in her Milk and Honey, 1984, formulates a type of metafiction in which the central character, Jacob, recounts his past in a maternal mental hospital. Aboriginal fiction. This is another category that will deal in this section. The Aboriginal novel is also a remarkable segment of Australian literature, despite the fact that Aborigines have long been regarded as representing a subaltern social category. They have come to register their protesting voice. Murdo uh, Nerojin's Long Live Sandwara, 1979, and Dr. Um, Hordy's Prescription for Enduring the Ending of the World, 1983, are significant examples. In both novels, Nerojin tries to use history as a source of symbolic action. Nerojin has meticulously portrayed the pretensions of mainstream white society in these novels. Women are also leading their voice to the spirit of protest. Monica Clare in Kerobran 1979 powerfully presents the story of an Aboriginal girl. These Aboriginal novelists try to project what Jack Davis, another Aboriginal writer, calls the real Australian story. The brief history of the developmental pages of the literary history of the Australian novel makes us makes it clear makes it clear that the clear about the general trends in fiction. At the same time, it also creates a perspective for the story of Patrick Pike's boss, which we will deal in detail. Moreover, uh, some general remarks on White's novels have been made for subordinating his position as a novelist, substantiating his position as a novelist. Let us now take a quick look at the major issues and concerns of the Australian writers. The earliest Australian novels deal with a new environment, the ability of lack of it to adapt to this strange land. It is concerned with the issues of survival, and life depends on the innovativeness and adaptability of its people. Emerging from this concern, the convict tradition gained prominence and was followed by the creation of a romantic convict character who, though a wronged man, was nonetheless morally upright. The legend of vast outdoors, the sense of freedom on the one hand, the building of friendships and bonding of males in the outback, life in the outback, the flight of women in the bush were other favorite themes with writers in Australia. With the discovery of gold and the progress made by urban centers, the distinction between life in the bush and city life captured the imagination of quite a few writers of this period. A growing consciousness of nationalism in the political world is equally reflected in fiction. With every major political change, the concerns of Australian fiction kept changing. When Australia adopted a multicultural policy, this was reflected in immigrant writing, sorry. Just as with the granting of citizenship to the Aborigines, Aboriginal literature has found a voice or two. By the early decades of the 20th century, uh, the Jendi War book movement, about which we discussed yesterday, had started. These literary men and women believed in cleansing themselves and their literature from all European influences in an effort to promote and present the real Australia. Judith Wright, an eminent contemporary poet, later claimed, "We are beginning to write no longer as a transplanted Europeans, nor as a restless men who reject the past and put their hopes only in the future, but as man with a present to be lived in and a past to nourish us." Unquote. The two world wars contributed in various ways to Australian fiction as a strong sense of anti-war sentiment developed. Not only this Australian fiction has always been concerned with its narrative style. In fact, some of the novels deal with the very theme of narrative style. It has played an important role in the development of the more modern Australian novel and has dictated tones to writers like Frank Hardy, Christina Stead, and Patrick White. The other concern of Australian fiction is the question of reality, the inevitable choice that the writer makes while working on his novel is a device that shows that, quote unquote, the chief consideration of Australian fiction has persistently been man's suspended disbelief in the world of his experience. So, to sum up, a rereading of the past, mythologizing of the history of Australian development, are important aspects of Australian literature in the aftermath of World War II. Australian literature has come a long way since 1788. At this stage, we can afford to look at the memoirs, the journals of the early writers trying to come to terms with their new environment. The early short stories and later works of fiction that shows the creation of the legend, the breaking of them, the building of a national literature and a nation, the usage of the Australian idiom, and the real flowering of Australian prose, poetry, and fiction in contemporary times. We have also seen the change of themes through the development of Australian literary history. Uh, Then we are now equipped to tackle the novel and the novelist. Novel is Voss and the writer is Patrick White. It would help us how to deal with the author of novel Voss. And that brings us to Unit 2, where we will read about Patrick White's the novel Voss. Actually, Voss is a novel set in 19th century Australia, following the story of Johann Ulrich Voss, a German explorer who leads an expedition into the Australian outback. The novel explores Voss' obsession with the desert landscape and his own spiritual quest, as well as the lives of those around him, including his lover, Laura Trebelin. It also deals with the typical exploration of Australian identity. White explores the complexities of Australian identity, particularly in relation to the country's indigenous people and European settlers. Then we come to know about the spirituality and the source of meaning. Boss journey is a metaphor for the source of spirituality and its meaning and the connection with the land. Then we also find something about colonialism and imperialism. The novel critiques the colonial project, highlighting the destructive impact of European settlement on indigenous cultures. Then there is a brilliant psychological insight present in the novel. White's prose offers profound psychological insights into the characters' inner lives, exploring themes of obsession, love, and redemption. Then the symbolism and the imagery used in the novel is very rich, uh, and the desert landscape representing the unknown, the sublime, and the spiritual is also very significant. Then, as far as the popularity of the novel, we see that the popularity of the novel is sky high because Patrick White was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1973 with Bose as his major work. What
Hello,
Bose is widely
hello.
regarded. Ah, yes.
Sir, your PPT is there. Sir, PPT is at the first page only on the objectives.
Ah, okay, okay. Now, I just wanted to tell you the brief introduction about the novel. Then we'll move to with the PPT. Okay.
Okay, okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Thank you. Then we see that the novel is very much popular and it helped its writer Patrick White to receive Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 1973. And many things are there, like the search for meaning, the natural power, colonialism and imperialism, spirituality and mysticism, isolation and loneliness, human condition, identity and self-discovery, morality and ethics, love and relationship, existentialism and absurdism. All the things are present in this novel, which make it a very complex and subtle narrative, so that the reader he gets deeper meanings while reading the novel. So, with this um, introduction, we can go to read the novel in detail, in some detail, of course, not um, uh, the whole of it, because we have to complete everything within 1 hour. So, when you come to the introduction part, we read boss and what is the most important theme about the novel is the theme of exploration. The novel's central emphasis is on a soul searching journey into the heart of Australia. Patrick White seems to historicize a distinctively real pattern of events and offers a kind of symbolic explanation. This novel is supposed to be based on the true record of Ludwig Lichard, who died in the Australian desert in 1948. The German explorer's endeavor to cross the Australian continent has been interpreted in terms of significant symbolic movement. It is therefore appropriate to approach the novel from the standpoint of Bose' character in the context of the complex nature of relationships. As we read the novel, we should try to discover how, as a stranger to the country, Bose reacts to the unknown land. Patrick White's intention is to show how Bose gradually reacts to this strange land and how he is also able to involve others in the process. Laura Trevelyan, for that he is going to, for instance, gets emotionally involved with Boss as also with the adventurous mission that he is going to undertake. And Mr. Bonner, the uncle of Laura, is immensely interested in the adventuristic project of Boss. It has been already decided by him that Boss will undertake his journey in a ship called Osprey that will carry him to Newcastle. He will then proceed towards Rhine Towers, where Mr. Sanderson will meet him. Finally, he will reach the last outpost, Dildra, where Mr. Boyle will welcome him. The arrangement The arrangements initiated by Mr. Bonner show his intense involvement in the entire project. In fact, the entire settlement of New South Wales seems to be absorbed in the project of Voss' journey. If you analyze the responses and reactions generated by Voss' project carefully, it seems that it is perhaps the most oblique initiation of the Australian dream, the dream of reaching into the very heart of the country, where colonial settlement seems inadequate in essentializing a total identification with the land. Now, we will move to analyze some important themes and issues in Patrick White. Patrick White's achievement as a novelist lies in the fact that he, for the first time, creates a distinctive Australian consciousness. Novelists writing before White could not properly substantiate a dignified Australian vision. In 1925, George M. Barnard wrote a novel called Leona, a story of bush life in Tasmania, but it fails to establish a dignified impression of the Australian bush and its people. Again, Neville Shute in novel like A Town Like Alice 1950 and The Breaking Wave 1955 creates Australian settings, but its chief intention was to cater to the taste of the British and the American readers. Patrick White was, however, able to perceive the predicament of the Australian tradition, which was striving to establish its identity as a homogeneous culture. It is a pity that White was badly reviewed and criticized by a group of Australian critics. In fact, he was not even warmly received in Australia as he had been in England and America. John Hay, in his brief memoirs of Ravenous Reader, writes, quote, he seemed to produce controversy with every novel, as his work was exploratory and different to the frontier tradition of Australian literature. Unquote. His exploratory his position as a novelist was, however, firmly established when he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1973. Every novelist begins with a search for an individual idiom. Naturally, the early phase of a creative writer could be more or less initiative. It is through imitation that he finally discovers his own creative voice. Patrick White's early novels, therefore, bear the influence of such eminent writers as D.H. Lawrence, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and T.S. Eliot. But his original talent as a novelist begins to come to forefront from the aunt's story onwards. White considers the act of writing as a quote unquote a struggle to create completely fresh forms out of the rocks and sticks of the words unquote. In this struggle, he has again and again discovered multiple forms and visions. Then we'll analyze the theme of the novel, The Horse and Australia. In a sense, the central protagonist of Patrick White's Boss is Australia. Just as in Shakespeare's history plays, the central protagonist is England itself, so also Australia as a strange country seems to be the focal point of this novel. The title of the novel seems to emphasize the character of Boss. At one level, the title is justified because the novel is essentially concerned with the experimental um, page of Bose in course of his journey. In other words, we discover a linear progressive pattern of Bose expedition, the prepare, preparation of the journey of the ship Osprey, their progress through Rhine Towers and Zildra, the beginning of their expedition through an arid landscape, varying degrees of predicament, the encounter with the aborigines, and the death of Boss. This is a slow and steady progress of the novel, and the climax is at the when Boss dies. It is always emphasized that the central concern of Boss is Australia. He is in Australia only for quote unquote 2 years and 4 months, but he has already formed a greater understanding of the land than the settlers of New South Wales. When Laura complains of the land being extremely monotonous, he finds himself quite at home. Quote, I am at home. It is like the poor parts of Germany, uh, though Laura fails to be intimate with her new home in New South Wales. Boss discovers the intense complexity of the country. Quote, your country is of great subtlety. In Boss' analysis, the expedition should not be merely considered at the concrete level of human experience. It is not just an adventuristic inclination that has drawn him to this precarious pursuit. In attempt to explore the country, he gradually begins to locate an element of infinity. Patrick White has always reiterated this theme of sublime infinity in most of his novels. The theme of topographical exploration is gradually sublimated to the level of spiritual experience. This is possible because Swift is essentially preoccupied with certain notions of religious mysticism. He has said, quote, religion that's behind all my novels, unquote. Boss knowledge about Australia therefore generates an awareness of infinity itself. Thus, Bose says to Lee Mesurier, quote, but in this disturbing country, so far as I have become acquainted with it already, it is possible more easily to discard the inessential and to attempt the infinite, unquote. Patrick White's boss ends with a series of death, but how should we interpret this idea of death is in the in the context of Boss' exploration of Australia? Does Australia itself symbolize a land of insurmountable obstacles, and those who try to concretize its strangeness in terms of exploration may not come back to the normative pattern of reality? After Boss and his party leave Dildra, they are gradually confronted by different forms of adversity. It may be suggested that Dildra is the last terminating point of the normative civilized world. When the explorers are exposed to the ruthlessness of Australian landscape, they gradually begin to develop multiple shades of feelings and reactions. Then we come to uh, analyze the human relationship in the novel. And in Voss, we find that there are different degrees of relationships, as many as four different levels of relationships governing the formal fictional patterns. One is Voss and Laura, the law of relationship, and Voss, the fellow travelers. Then explorers and the aborigines. The last one is the Voss and the settlers of the New South Wales. These facets of relationships interrogate the basic thematic structure of the novel, and we have already formed some ideas regarding these relationships, and we should therefore emphasize two particular forms of relationships that have not been extensively dealt with earlier. The two levels are boss and the Bonner family, boss and his fellow travelers. And we have to sum up because we will have to go to another 3 units. Patrick White in Boss takes the role of a presenter who upholds the patterns and perspectives of the inner being of Australia. In his analysis, Voss emerges as a distinctive symbol trying to go beyond the limited vision of the settlers. His journey through Australia is therefore a symbolic journey. Moreover, Pite has presented a pattern of intense emotive experience. This is largely evident in the Voss-Laura relationship. Now, this brings us to the unit number 3, where we explicitly deal with the romantic elements and the relationship between Boss and Laura, where we left in the last unit. Excuse me. Exploration as such is regarded to be the task of an adventurer. When a new land begins to be inhabited, scientists, geographers, and anthropologists begin through research on the land, but this research is limited to the level of apparent reality. This is the pen and paper reality. In other words, it becomes an exploration of the conditions of the land, its people and customs, its forests and rivers. But as we concentrate on the literary text, pause, we find that the theme of exploration grows to acquire a new dimension. Exploration itself becomes a significant component of stabilizing a distinctive sense of romanticism. Patrick White's verse may, in this sense, be regarded as a specific romantic text. Verse may be considered a paradigmatic text executing a process of exploration and journey. White meticulously portrays a complicated linear movement and creates an interweaving pattern of progression and suffering. It is this idea of exploration that therefore amounts to an accumulation of emotional intensity. In so, the sense of romanticism at two distinctive levels is very significant in this context. In the first place, we have the presentation of the journey as the significant romantic component, and secondly, there is also an attempt, the emotional movement in terms of the relationships between the central characters, Rose and Laura. Then we'll move to the view of Reg Ingmels, the founder of Dindi War Books movement, who commented in conditional culture about the conditional culture. Quote, the real test of a people's culture is the way in which they can express themselves in relation to their environment and the loftiness and the universality of their artistic conceptions raised on that basis. The specific statement largely points out at the Australian quest for self-assertion and romantic individualism, and we will see the theme of quest, romantic quest for journey. Um, Next, we will discuss about that. Patrick White's boss also projects an exploratory journey in which the spirit of romanticism is largely associated with the discovery of sublime strangeness. If it had been merely an exploration of the physical topography of the land, it would be nothing short of a travelogue. It is true that Voss presents a long journey through the arid topography of Australia, but Patrick White never intends to generate a geographical awareness of the land. He instead tries to make the readers intensely aware of the static romanticism growing out of the multiple emotions created by the mysticality of land. The idea of journey projected in the novel is essentially experimental, uh, experiential in nature. We can read it as experimental in nature. In fact, the progress through the land is a journey into one's own self. It is a kind of self-discovery. In New South Wales, Boss comes to know the settlers, the small world of Mr. Bonner, and other settlers forming an Australian microcosm. Boss encounters a mimetic version of the motherland the settlers have left behind. There is also a curious interweaving of the convict past project projected, convict past, projected in terms of some of the settlers. The first stage of Voss journey takes the party by sea to Newcastle and overland through the gentle, healing landscape of the Hunter to Rhine Towers. Rhine Towers, in the care of the uh, Sandersons, is a place of simplicity, perfection, and hidden in the bush. Boss leads the party from the sublime valley across New England to the flat, cool labs country. Dindra is the Dildra is the last outpost before the wilderness. West of Dildra lies the desert. Once the expedition left Dildra, Bose was on the expedition to the outer limits of his imagination. This is a quotation from David Marr. Now we have other things like element of love and the love between Boss and Laura. And I would like to read one passage about the relationship between Laura and Boss. Quote: I wanted to write a story of a grand passion. Don't jump. So this is at the same time the story of a girl called Laura uh, Trevelyan, the niece of a Sydney merchant, one of the patrons of Voss expedition. It is different from other grand passions in that it grows in the minds of the two people concerned more through the stimulus of their surroundings and through almost irrelevant incidents. Boss and Laura only meet 3 or 4 times before the expedition sets out. They even find each other partly antipathetic. Yet, Boss writes proposing to the girl on one of the early stages of the journey, partly out of vanity and partly because um, he realizes he is already lost. She accepts partly out of a desire to save him from his delusions of divinity, partly out of a longing for religious faith to which she feels she can only return to through love. So this gives the intensity, the detachment, the um, attraction and repulsion together, and how their passion of journey or expedition becomes more important than physical passion because they don't meet very often. Then you come to see something about romantic landscape and other things, the romantic world. Uh, the world of walls is a world of strange discovery. It is He is a German explorer who has come away from his homeland in order to discover the strange primitiveness of the interior of Australia. Thus, sitting at the house of Mr. Bonner, he remembers how he wavered between different ambitions. His father was a timber merchant, and his mother was a sentimental woman. At first, it was decided that he would become a great surgeon, but he quote unquote was revolted by the um, pul- pulsating bodies of man. Then it was thought that he would become a botanist, but finally he leaves Germany to become an explorer. But what does really bring him to Australia? Australia perhaps became a strange icon for him, an icon representing a romantic obsession. Thus, the stereotyped careers of a surgeon or a botanist do not really satisfy him. He wants to work out a new kind of future. He says to Laura, quote, your future is what you will make of it. Future is a will. It is because of this emphasis on his personal will that he stands apart from the others. This naturally conduces to misunderstanding and miscomprehension. Quote, some pitied him, some despised him for his funny appearance of a foreigner. None he realized with a tremor of anger was conscious of his strength. Mediocre animal man never to gaze at the power of rock of fire until the last moment before the elements reduce them to nothing. Unquote. Then the themes of exploration and the romantic sensibility is very much present in the novel, and this is a distinctive romantic awareness that we had dealt with in this unit. The journey itself implies a significant romantic mysticality. If we analyze the character of Bose appropriately, we find that he is a specific romantic icon. His journey is therefore a romantic quest. In other words, it becomes a progress towards the unknowable. Moreover, Laura becomes romantically inclined to the spirit of enchantment generated by this element of strange quest. Again, the frequent alternation between New South Wales and the mystical interior of Australia creates a constant shift of focus. Thus, throughout the novel, we notice a significant opposition between the rebel of reality and that of romanticism. So, this brings us to the uh, unit number 5, unit number 4, where we'll discuss other themes. The theme novel is very complex and subtle in nature. So, in order to understand all the things, we have to analyze the multiple themes that are present in the novel. Boss, whereas we have discussed the romantic connection and the romantic exploration in the last unit, we will concentrate on the uh, strangeness, the mysterious aspect of the land. We'll consider the vast primitive aspect of Australia and the strange perspective of this land on this land may be perceived only when we consider it in connection with the problem of identity. So, the expression of identity is at the root of exploring all the themes. The multiple aspect of the land in a bits and bits manner has been already discussed. Now, the land comes to be connotative only when its identity is ascertained. It is therefore important to consider the perspective of nature, its relation to the world of man. Moreover, the ways in which different characters contribute towards creating, endorsing, stabilizing its identity. The history of Australian literature is marked by a continuous struggle to resolve the tension between the individual identity of the settlers and the land they have come to inhabit. This naturally presupposes a strategic adaptation to a strange land, which since time immemorial has been man's persistent effort at stabilizing himself in varying situations. In prehistoric times, when the mm, Achaean tribes invaded Greece around 2200 BC, they encountered a similar problem in adjusting to the indigenous uh, Pelasgian culture. If we suggest that many early poets and novelists of Australia were mostly convicts transported from England, and as such their vision of Australia was that of foreigners artificially transplanted in a strange country, we would be holding the stick by the wrong end. In fact, the early settlers gradually acclaimed themselves and discovered a new allegiance. One may be reminded of Mary Gilmore's famous tribute to the pioneers of her poem, Old Botany Way. In her poem, Old Botany Way, quote, I was the conscript sent to hell to make in the desert the living well. After the initial phase of strangeness and the consequent mode of identifying oneself with the new land, there is a gradual and growing spirit of enchantment. Thus, Mary Gilmore recounts the pristine purity of the early phase of settlement. Quote, there were no bad smells about the bush when the kingdom of the wild was its own kingdom. It was not till the settlement came, the earth sank and the sewers burst. Once Australia smelt like Spice Islands. Ships knew before they came to her. We are near Australia, said the seaman. Can't you smell the flowers? This spirit of enchantment is equally noticeable in Walter Modus, who discovers a sublime ecstasy even in a spectacle of fire. Quote, no language could convey an idea of the wonder and the terror and the beauty of the spectacle by night, when the valley below you and the hillsides around you are all one red roaring hell of furious destruction. In short, these facets are related to the problem of land insofar as the settlers discover new roots in a strange country. But the problem of identity is complex and raises multiple themes and issues. When the British arrived in Australia, it was not an empty country. Even before the British arrived, the Australian Aboriginals were roaming about in this country, for 40,000 years. When the first fleet of settlers reached the shore of Australia, there were at least 3 lakh aborigines in Australia belonging to many different tribal groups like the Koris, the Nimbans, the Nungas, the Lora, and so on. They survived with their hunting skills, indigenous customs, and pagan totemism. This problem of land and identity naturally look took the shape of a warlike confrontation between the natural citizens and the destined citizens, between the state of primal innocence and the strategic intention of settlement. These multiple layers of tension between the intruders and the natural inhabitants conduce to a complex structure of racist relationship. This is partly recorded in the sad history of such aborigines as Benelong or Permalboy. At this stage, we would like to tell you a little about these two men. When Arthur Phillip was the governor, he was ordered to live, quote unquote, in amity and kindness with the Aborigines. He, however, wanted to develop a kind of relationship with them in order to be able to procure food, etc., and to be able to take them English and turn it to the advantage of the colony. With this intention in mind, he tried to befriend several Aborigines. When that did not work, he decided to kidnap a few of them, force them to learn English, and act as intermediaries between the two races. Arabano was the first to be captured and was quite successfully converted into an Englishman, but he died during the epidemic of smallpox that wiped out half of the uh, Aboriginal tribe, the Gamarjal tribe, in mid 1789. So this is about the struggle and the struggle of Aborigines and the settlers, white settlers, and then we come to the struggle between nature and man. In the New South Wales, the natural background seems to be obliterated by the intrusion of a civilized pattern of life. Nature is here um, articulated into the artifice of a garden. Laura therefore asks Voss to see the garden of her uncle. Quote, "You must see the garden. Uncle has made it his hobby." When Voss asks if they go much into the country, Laura again refers to it in terms of pleasure trips or picnics. Quote, "Not really, not often. We drive out sometimes for picnics, you know." Unquote. Here we come across a kind of drawing room society, gossiping, chatting, and absorbed in their world of small interests. But we discover different patterns of nature. In New South Wales, Boss is particularly struck by the growing pleasantness of nature. Quote, "It was gentle, healing landscape in those parts." Unquote. Again, Sanderson, who leads Voss to Rhine Towers, is a man of culture, though he is secluded from the artificial pageantry of civilized life. He remains absorbed in his own world of contemplation. They, Sanderson and his wife, had a whole uh, row of books bound in leather and were forever developing them. So let us now take a brief look at nature at Zildra. At Zildra, nature becomes a dry and parched. Quote, "By now the tall grass was almost dry, so that there issued from it a sharper sighing when the wind blew." Unquote. But nature here expands into something vast, mysterious, and secretive. It appears to be hard country of secret knowledge.
एक पैकेट में
Above,
कितना
please
आता है?
mute
पता
your
नहीं,
mic.
50 तो होगा, 50 60 तो 50 नहीं आता है,
Abu,
30 पैकेट आता है, 20 पैकेट जो आता है,
do
10
you hear
रुपए
me?
का बंडल
Please
होता है।
mute
एक
your
पैकेट
mic.
कितना का नहीं तो 30 आता है, 30 मतलब 30 60 रुपीस का 65 ना 70 ऐसे का है पैकेट में। कौन सा? एक पैकेट में फुल एक पैकेट में दो बंडल आता है। हाँ, पैकेट दो होता है। हाँ। एक पैकेट में 30 होता है। दो में 7। एक पैकेट কত?
Abu, please mute your mic. Okay. So, the seasonal cycle in the novel develops a pattern of linear extremity. It starts with the spring, thus Patrick White describes, quote, one evening that spring when the street was already dissolving and amiable pedestrians were calling to one another in friendship, unquote. But there is a distinctive change in the seasonal impression as the explorers leave Giltra. Quote, they had entered as it happened, a valley sculptured in a red rock and a quartz, unquote. As they proceed further, they begin to be swept by intermittent showers of rain. In this context, we may also consider a significant topographical design. The story begins at the New South Wales, which represents an apparently semi-urban civilized society with the Bonner family at the center of fictive design. We depart with the boss and his party to proceed towards Newcastle and then to Gildra. Finally, we are led into the arid topography of the continent. Moreover, the journey by the ship, Os- Ospreys, is also briefly padded into the design. There are, therefore, three different topographical perspectives: land, water, and the desert. These three topographical variables create a triune perspective that creates a sense of integral totality to the novel. And we'll move to problem of identity, which is a very pertinent issue in the novel. Here, identity means an assertion of the individual self, but this sense of identity comes to assume a greater significance only when it is studied in relation to its immediate context. In Australia, this sense of identity should be examined with reference to the settlers, but their sense of identity becomes meaningful when their relation with the land is appropriately substantiated. So we will have to discuss these things in the context of a boss and his sense of identity. Boss journey is not merely an explorer's adventurism. It is perhaps a quest for determining the nature of individual identity in a strange land. In endeavoring to explore this country, Boss and his teammates begin to determine their identity within a particular framework of contextuality. The entire process of the journey becomes, in effect, a linear progression into the psyche, a journey towards the self, but the question of identity may be properly ascertained with reference to the sense of totality. While the settlers themselves feel distanced from the spirit of the country, Boss, even though an explorer may be identified with this land, while Radcliffe says that the country does not belong to Boss, Laura affirms, quote, it is his by right of vision, quote, unquote. It is only this right of vision that generates identification with the land. Thus, the unknown strange land that Voss undertakes to explore becomes incarnate in the personality of Voss. Laura, therefore, static, statically says, I am fascinated by you. You are my desert. Unquote. The right of vision accelerates a greater perception of the country and its inhabitants. Though the whites living in New South Wales are firmly established in this country, they are culturally as well as psychologically distanced from it. They have come here either as free settlers or as convicts. Hence, proper assimilation into its culture is yet to be achieved. Though settled in Australia, the country they have left still lurks in the background. Their basic inadequacies lie in their attempt to discover in Australia those value systems they have left in England. They forget that England is their past and it is part of their memory, but Australia is their present and it forms the local and total perception of their immediate reality. Therefore, Laura's proud claim, quote unquote, I was born in England, seems to be self defeating. But Australia is the governing symbol that exists as a form of strange timelessness. The final page of Voss's journey is only apparently racist, but there is an inner layer of ritualism. The surface pattern of the journey projects a confrontation between the whites and the blacks. The blacks again and again interrupt and restore the explorers. They steal their compass, their kettle, and finally they take away Jude and Boss, and they kill Boss. The killing of the horse, the reference to the Snake King, all seem to be part of a ritualistic performance through which Boss ultimately comes to be amalgamated into the original native perspective of the land. Perhaps there is a suggestion of a total self extinction through which one can be absorbed into the land's native purity. Thus, even before his death, he can perceive the archetypal pattern of native life. The man, quote, the man had painted their bodies with the warm colors of the earth. They knew totem by totem, and which had prevailed at last over the cold, nebulous country of the stars, unquote. Now, we'll come to know about Laura's sense of identity. Um, Laura initially strikes us as a quite silent and reserved woman, largely absorbed in her own world of mystical meditation. But gradually, she is drawn to this source of her identity. Laura seems to be a paradigm of waiting, but this particular aspect of her character is distinctively related to the central theme of identity. Living within the closed framework of civilized pattern, she almost runs coextensive with Voss's journey. Thus, even in the course of Voss's journey, where she is not physically present, she appears and disappears in terms of Voss's mystic vision. She spiritually accompanies Voss and continues to be an inevitable part of the journey. Though she in fact remains confined to the concrete world of New South Wales, she undergoes a metaphysical experience of being transported to the world of Voss. It is through such experiences that she begins to be identified with the Australian world. She also becomes gradually entangled with Rose's psychic struggle in relation to her pregnancy. The entire household develops a sense of hatred against Rose. Mrs. Bonner particularly finds it extremely disturbing, but Laura becomes Laura becomes sympathetically associated with Rose. The birth of Rose's child and Laura's determination to protect the child after Rose's sudden death may be read as a distinctive symbol. The child is an Australian in its true sense of the term. All the characters presented here and mostly foreigners settled in Australia. Naturally, they are implanted in this country and they have no indigenous claim on this country. But the child is born in Australia and it really symbolizes the making of a country and foreshadows the Australian dream. For Laura, it is perhaps the future, the determined future of a generation that properly belongs to this country, born and brought up in a country that they would love. Thus, Laura indirectly contributes to the specific theme of identity. Now, we'll go to the theme of suffering in verse, which is an important one. In the epigraph to his first novel, The Happy Valley, Patrick White used a quotation from Mahatma Gandhi. Quote, "It is impossible to do away with the law of suffering, which is the one indispensable condition of our being." Unquote. Sorry. The progress is to be measured by the amount of suffering undergone. The purer the suffering, the greater the suffering. Unquote. This quotation implies his assertion of suffering as a distinctive element in his novels. Boss particularly substantiates the nature of intense suffering, though it fictionalizes the story of a megalomaniac explorer. Yet the major concern of the novel seems to be the complex virtue of suffering. David Marr, in his biography of Patrick White, has tried to relate this question of suffering with the novelist's personal life. He therefore comments, quote, White saw himself as a sufferer, as an asthmatic, homosexual, foreigner, and artist, unquote. But he was at the same time aware of the fact that he had never been exposed to the vast misery, poverty. Moreover, his immense friendship with uh, Lascars saved him. Lascaris saved him from absolute loneliness. But Patrick White considered suffering as a constructive and positive principle of life. David Mad comments again, quote, Yet he saw suffering as a force of his life, making him what he was, making us as we are. For White, pain is a force of history, shaping man and events. White once said, quote, I have always found in my own case that something positive, either creative or moral, has come out of anything I have experienced in the ways of affliction. Unquote. So now we'll take up next the religion in verse. Patrick White's works are generally accepted quote unquote marking a new departure in its concentration on the inner spiritual crisis and in individual religious experience. This is by Dorothy Green. His works are pervaded by Christian imagery and explore the various dimensions of the Christian doctrines of grace and salvation. Moreover, as Amos Wilder and Charles Glixbury comment, he realized the fact, quote, that to be meaningful and relevant in the context of the contemporary world, the religious stance must necessitate an involvement with, not a withdrawal from, the realities of ordinary human existence. Unquote. So what Patrick White did was preach not any coherent set of orthodox doctrines, but believes in the existence of a non and of a transcendental order that more or less impinges directly on the life and destiny of the individual human being, who must therefore work out a satisfactory relationship with the adjustment to that order. That is evident in our very own noble boss as well. The religious spirit that exists in Voss, in keeping with that in his other novels, is also very responsive to nature, the birds, beasts, flowers, and also to the world of other fellow human beings. Fight has the unique capacity to draw imagery from the natural world and then to use that to dramatize this transcendental vision, his transcendental vision that once again reinstates the sense of its significance to the religious spirit. So, what we have here is a professed religious order that is extremely responsive to nature and that which creates a religious order vision with its imagery. So let us quickly sum up this unit. Uh, the two significant aspects of the novel are considered here. At the fictional level, we may locate a distinct pattern of storytelling, making use of all kinds of usual characteristic components, but it also conceals a pattern of history. Patrick White has carefully historicized Australian nature and shows man's heroic struggle with this unfavorable topography. Again, in the process of this struggle, he comes to rediscover himself. This distinctiveness of this land, the distinctiveness of this land helps him to identify himself. In this way, a true perspective of history has been created in Voss. Now, this brings us to the uh, last unit, modern readings, and how we can interpret a Voss through other criticisms and critical insights. One of the essential methods of postmodern critical analysis is to deconstruct the codified levels of meaning and the deconstruction of Derrida and Paul de Man on the philosophy as well as the literary scene. Many revolutionary changes in the methodology of literary analysis took place. This led to the subversion of fixed code of meanings and encouraged a multiplicity of interpretation. The widening vista of interpretation will be evident in the novel Voss, and the postmodern approach is very important here. Now we can compare between these two, the great epic Iliad and Voss for the epic dimension present in the novel. We have in Iliad assembly of the Achaean soldiers. In Voss, we have Voss collection of certain adventures. Then in Iliad, we find the vastness of the epic battle. Here, we find the panoramic history of the journey. In Iliad, we have difference between Achilles and Agamemnon. Here, we find the difference between Boss and Turner. In Iliad, we find Achilles' withdrawal with the uh, Myrmidons. Here, we find the withdrawal of Turner and others with Jode and as the leader. So, Boss presents an epic dimension here, and we'll come to know about the text and the meaning. The modern quest for knowledge begins to take shape in a different direction with Edmund Husserl's phenomenological philosophy that considers the world as a reflection of consciousness and speech as an expression of absolute meanings that exist separately from language. Husserl's phenomenology holds further that pure meaning exists first as a pre-verbal transcendental signified and then finds expression through the human voice. But this critical position is challenged by Jacques Derrida's notion of deconstruction that stands firmly against Husserl's critical principle insofar as Derrida questions the latter's belief in the pre-linguistic absolute meaning. Derrida finds a difference or division within the sign between its two aspects. In other words, he discovers an infinite range of variables in the interrelation of the signifier and the signified. He believes that a signifier could suggest a large number of possible signifiers. Thus, Derrida's post-structuralist notion of deconstruction finds fault with the absolute notion that confines meaning to a limited boundary. Derrida visualizes an open-ended, infinite possibility of meaning that opens up an appropriate perspective of modern explication. It advocates multiplicity of interpretations of one text, and Patrick White's voice may conform to a deconstructive pattern through a large number of explications intended in the text. He has therefore marked a sharp break from the traditional story arrangement and contrasted a terrible expectation with the normative design of life. Again, frequent intuitions of visions and telepathic correlation presents a collapse of traditional realism. If we prepare a gist of the story pattern, it will appear surprisingly right, slight. We come across Voss, the German explorer, at the house of Mr. Bonner, who is there with the explicit purpose of crossing the Australian continent. Here he collects fellow adventurers, develops a mutual feeling of love with Laura, and makes for the disastrous journey. Then follows an alternative pattern of Voss progress and the reactions in the house of Mr. Bonner with a distinct emphasis on Laura's love-lorn waiting. It ends with the creation of a chasm within the party and the consequent death of Voss and the others in the desert. Things are rounded off with the discovery of the mysterious conditions of Voss' death and Laura's prospective hopefulness. Voss has been presented as a figure that stands opposite to steadfast fixed meanings. He, in fact, considers the deconstructive method of destroying limitations of meaning. When Mr. Bonner seems doubtful of the results of the expedition and asks, quote, "You are aware, I should say, what it could mean," unquote. Voss replies, quote, "We could compare meanings, we would arrive perhaps at different conclusions," unquote. Even the figure of Voss himself is deconstructed by means of interactions of the other characters. When he refuses to dine with the Bonners, different perspectives of the man come to the surface. Quote unquote, a rude man saw Mr. Bonner, quote unquote, a foreigner saw peace, and quote unquote, someone to whom I am completely indifferent. So, Laura Dublin. Even in matters of primary discussions or the mapping of the journey, there is an emphasis on open-ended indeterminacy. When boss teammates try to present a slapdash dependence on a fixed purpose, Lee uh, Messier ironically says, purpose. So far, no purpose. But Bose perfectly realizes the nature of variability. He therefore says, quote unquote, I would be purposeless in this same sea. Again, Vizier asked about the time to be covered by this expedition. But Bose rejects any formulaic codification. Quote, 1 month, 2 months, it is not yet decided, unquote. The moment of their journey in a ship has also been conceived in terms of multiple reactions from the standpoint of involved spectators. Boss and the party set sail in a ship called mm, Osprey that has become almost a symbol of a microcosmic world proceeding towards a strange infinite macrocosm. The entire picture once again comes to be deconstructed through the varying attitudes of three women. For Laura, it is an escape out into a broad perspective world. Yes, there they have got away. Rose um, Porson feels inclined to pray, pray for explorers, quote unquote, oh, I will pray for them. Belly suddenly waxes eloquent on Palfreyman's nicety, quietude, and kindness. But such scattered, disjointed opinions are merged into a deep sense of melancholia. Thus, this essential impact finally yields a larger dimension of inexplicable sadness. Quote, their bodies severed in their thin groans, their minds were exposed to the keenest barbs of thought, and the whole scene that their vision embraced became distinct and dancing beautiful but sad. Unquote. The cave experience of the explorers points to the range of flexible variables present in the novel. The cave, with its rock drawings, and not only indicates a sense of shelter, but a sense of mysterious interior that creates a design out of an apparent formlessness. But the experimental mode of all this has been deconstructed by the interpretative variety of the reactions quote unquote, the simplicity of and truthfulness of the symbol was at times terribly apparent to the extent that each man interpreted them to a foreshadowing, according to his own needs and level. But the deconstructive variants finally lead up to a foreshadowing of boss death at the end. The picture in the cave, therefore, seems to point at a linear teleological movement, quote unquote. See this. See, this man is going to die. They have gone in at the back through the shoulder blades. So we have other themes present in the um, story and in the novel. So we will have to sum up before we wind up. White's novel thus deconstructed to a which leads us to a significant conclusion. Deconstruction Deconstruction expands through a presentation of a large number of uncodified variables, the perception of knowledge. This central force is also at work through the hermeneutics of signifieds. Thus, Bose is sometimes an ordinary man, sometimes a foreigner, sometimes a leader, and sometimes a god. Laura is also a woman, an intellectualized idea, even a dream. These variables are posed in terms of um, a number of relationships, the journey that was undertakes, the inner development of Laura finally held a process of gradual transition from being to becoming. In the garden episode, Laura simply looks upon herself and Boss as floundering, quote unquote, into each other's private beings. But this shades off into an acceptance of life as continuum that grows, develops, and finally embraces the finality of life. Thus, during the cave experience, both states quote, the mystery of life is not solved by success, which is an end in itself, but in failure, in perpetual struggle, in becoming, unquote. It is this process of becoming that turns Bha's journey into a quest, into a myth, and makes him a part of legends and history. Thus, Colonel Hebden says, uh, quote unquote, Mr. Bose is already history. This makes Bose an idea enwrapped in an unscrutable mystery. The people are all curious and keen to find out the concrete reality about Boss and thus dogged and boiled question the black fellow in an effort to know the truth. Cornell also continues his search for truth. Finally, Jude presents the bare truth of his death. But it does not remain confined merely to an area of information, rather, it becomes a part of the cognitive pattern of knowledge. Earlier in the novel, Walsh had already underlined this principle of knowledge in his own mystical way. Quote unquote, perhaps the true knowledge only comes of death by torture in the country of the mind. Laura comes to visualize the ultimate meaning of an abstraction, of a man turning into an idea. She therefore says, quote, Boss did not die. He is there still. It is said in the country and always will be. His legend will be written down eventually by those who have been troubled by it. Unquote. This rightly affirms the development from being to becoming. So, with this, we will end today's proceedings, and we are already uh, into the final pages of our class today. And I hope you have got some insight into the novel. And this is a very important novel as far as your um, preparation for the examination is concerned, and I hope you will do well in this paper if you attempt this mm, question on Patrick White's novel was, and we I hope you will do well in the forthcoming examination. And with the best of luck, if you have some problems, you can WhatsApp me and some. Uh, okay, I will add you, but I don't know your number. You do one thing. You can ask uh, the regional center Okay, I will add your number 976.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Good evening.
Sir, also please add this number also. From the first day I am telling, I was
Okay.
still not in the group also.
Okay. Okay. I will do that. Don't worry.
Okay, sir.
Uh,
Sir, please note this number or take the screenshot so that you can add it later. But please do it.
okay. Thank you. And this is for today. I hope you have got an entry into Patricia White's Nobel Prize. And one thing you should remember that you have some writing practice, right? This will help you uh, mm, to do well in the examination. While we get very bad response from the examiners, they don't have any positive impact, positive impression on your performances. That is why you be serious and do well. It's not at all difficult, but one thing you should do is to have some grounding. Don't think that boss is an epic. Loss is only a novel. So these basic mistakes you commit, and that is why you don't have a good impression on the examiners. And we get such reports. That is why I would like to advise all of you to at least have some simple working idea about the novel and try to interpret the novel as a novel, not other forms of literature like short story or poetry or something like that. And with this, I would like to end today's proceedings. I hope you will consider my advice positively and don't feel disheartened. You will get advice or guidance from us time to time. But the only thing is you have to execute it. We can only advise you, we cannot write for you. That is why you just prepare at least once or twice before you give the examination so that it will help you to at least have a working idea about what you want to do in the examination. And we see the papers. That is why we have this feeling and sometimes we are quite helpless. We want to give you numbers, but we are totally undone. That is why you think these sayings in positively and act accordingly. Just planning won't help. What will help is your preparation and your execution. Thank you.